Most people think the hardest part of being Mescalero Apache was fighting the United States Army. It wasn't. Long before American soldiers entered their homeland, hunger, thirst, disease, brutal winters, and relentless desert heat were already claiming lives. Every single day began with the same question: would there be enough food and water to survive tomorrow? And that was only the beginning. This is the uncensored reality of the Mescalero Apache. Long before sunrise, people were already moving through the camp. Hunters disappeared into the hills while the air was still cool enough to travel. Others headed for springs before the heat settled over the valleys. Fires burned only briefly. There was little reason to sit around them. Every hour after sunrise made life harder. The Mescalero lived in one of the harshest landscapes in North America. Mountains, forests, deserts, and open grasslands blended into a country where a single mistake could become fatal. Not because enemies were everywhere, because the land never promised you another meal. A hunter could follow fresh tracks from dawn until sunset and come home with nothing. A spring that had supplied water all summer might suddenly be little more than damp sand. Even after a successful hunt, there was no guarantee the next one would be. That uncertainty shaped almost everything. The Mescalero never depended on one source of food. While some searched for buffaloes, antelope, deer, or rabbits, others gathered prickly pear fruit, acorns, berries, edible roots, seeds, and whatever else the season offered. Every plant had its time. Knowing where to look was often more valuable than carrying another weapon. Then there was one plant that changed everything. The agave looked like little more than a cluster of thick, spiny leaves growing out of dry, rocky ground. Most travelers walked straight past it without a second glance. The Mescalero saw one of the most dependable food sources in the Southwest. They cut out its heart, buried it beneath hot stones, and left it roasting underground for days. When the pit was finally opened, the hard, bitter core had become a sweet, nourishing food that could feed families long after fresh meat had disappeared. Spanish explorers noticed how important the plant was and eventually named the people after it. Even that, however, was no guarantee. Some years the rains barely came. Game drifted into distant mountains, springs shrank, and every decision suddenly mattered more than the one before. I think this is one of the hardest parts of Mescalero life for us to truly understand. For them, the question of where the next meal would come from never really went away. Boys followed older hunters into the mountains years before they were trusted with a bow. They learned to read fresh tracks pressed into the dust, watched experienced hunters judge tomorrow's weather by the shape of distant clouds, and discovered that patience usually brought home more food than speed ever could. The lessons were rarely explained. They were watched, repeated, and remembered because one day a mistake could cost someone a meal. Girls faced challenges that were no less demanding. They gathered food, collected firewood, cared for younger children, prepared hides, and gradually learned which plants could feed a family and provide materials, medicine, and practical help in daily life. That knowledge passed from mothers and grandmothers to the next generation because no one else was going to teach it. Even the youngest children carried water, gathered kindling, or helped prepare meals. Nobody expected children to do the work of adults, but everyone was expected to contribute. A family survived together, or it did not survive at all. By the time a boy was old enough to ride beside the older men, he already understood the lesson that mattered most. The land could not always provide enough. Some years the rains never came. Deer disappeared into higher country. Harsh winters emptied entire valleys. Families could search for days and still come home with nothing. When that happened, survival demanded choices that people living today rarely have to imagine. For the Mescalero, one of those choices was raiding. To outsiders, a raid often looked like senseless violence. To the Mescalero, it could mean the difference between feeding a family and watching it go hungry through another winter. It could secure horses, livestock, weapons, goods, food, and leverage in a violent frontier economy. A successful raid rarely began with horses charging across open ground. It began days earlier. Warriors watched isolated ranches from distant ridges, counting horses, studying routines, and waiting. They learned when herds were left unattended, where rifles were stored, which trails were used most often, and which narrow canyon could hide and escape. Every route was planned before anyone moved. Only then did they strike. The goal was never to fight a battle. The goal was to be gone before one could begin. Horses were the greatest prize. They meant food through trade, faster travel, successful hunts, and the ability to escape pursuing soldiers. Cattle, blankets, rifles, ammunition, and supplies mattered too, because every one of them increased a family's chances of surviving another season. What fascinates me is how carefully planned these raids actually were. Hollywood often turns them into chaotic attacks, but in reality they depended on patience, planning, and knowing the country better than anyone chasing you. The raid itself could be over in minutes. Escaping alive was the part that mattered. The Mescalero understood that the moment they disappeared with horses, cattle, or supplies, the hunt had already begun. Within hours, soldiers were saddling up, ranchers were gathering armed posses, and scouts were already spreading across the country. Every hour made escape more difficult. They almost never rode into unknown country. Before a single horse was taken, they already knew where they would cross the mountains, where they could disappear, and where they would find water if the pursuit lasted for days. Narrow canyons concealed trails that barely existed. Dry creek beds swallowed hoofprints. Hidden springs kept small bands alive in country where entire cavalry columns struggled to survive. The army trusted roads. The Mescalero trusted memory. Every ridgeline, every canyon, every spring, every stand of pinyon trees had been memorized long before the first soldier ever arrived. What looked like empty wilderness to the army was a map the Mescalero could read almost without thinking, and that changed everything. Many soldiers believed they were hunting the Apache, but quite often, the Apache had been watching them for hours. An experienced scout could read an approaching cavalry column long before the first blue uniform came into view. A cloud of dust on the horizon, fresh wagon tracks pressed into hard ground, smoke rising from a distant campfire. They almost never fought battles they didn't have to fight. Why face an entire cavalry column when you could strike a supply train instead? Why attack a fort when a lonely patrol carried the same rifles, horses, and ammunition with a fraction of the risk? That is why so many soldiers describe the Apache as ghosts. They appeared without warning, struck hard, and disappeared just as quickly. By the time the army reached the place where the attack had happened, they were already miles away, hidden somewhere beyond the next ridge and preparing for whatever came next. Not every raid ended the way most people imagine. Sometimes the fighting was over long before the real story began. Children taken during raids could be adopted into Apache families, exchanged, ransomed, or held for varying periods. Sometimes they learned the Apache language, grew up alongside Apache children, and in many cases eventually became full members of the community. Adults faced a far less predictable fate. Some were exchanged or ransomed. Others remained captives for years. Enemy warriors, especially during periods of intense conflict, could be executed in retaliation for earlier attacks. Every decision depended on who had been taken, who had been killed, and what had happened before. And that before mattered more than almost anything else. One stolen horse could trigger another raid. One killing could lead to another act of retaliation. Families sometimes carried those memories for decades, and children grew up hearing stories about relatives they had never met but were still expected to avenge. In a world with no reliable courts and little outside protection, reputation became its own form of security. If people believed your family never answered an attack, they might see you as an easier target the next time. The cost of doing nothing could be just as dangerous as the cost of fighting back. What began as a single raid could grow into years of retaliation, with each side believing it was answering the violence of the other. Almost everyone thought they were responding to something that had already been done to them. And yet, even in a life shaped by hunger, hardship, and constant danger, The Mescalero never built their identity around war alone. The sunrise ceremony marked one of the defining moments in a young woman's life. It was not simply a celebration. The puberty rite is still a sacred 4-day rite of passage from girlhood to womanhood, involving dancing, blessings, songs, rituals, and guidance from ceremonial leaders. For days she dances, endures exhaustion, and follows sacred rituals guided by elders and songs honoring white-painted woman, the spiritual figure of renewal and life. Her body is pushed to its limits, but that is never the true purpose. The ceremony teaches resilience, responsibility, and the understanding that becoming an adult means carrying the well-being of others as well as your own. Young men followed a different path. No single ceremony declared them adults. They earned that place little by hunting successfully, protecting others, making good decisions, and proving they could be trusted when lives depended on them. A man was not declared. He was recognized. Survival was never something they turned to only when danger appeared. It was simply the way they lived.